Margaret Calloway pressed her dead husband's wedding ring into her palm so hard it left a circle of white in her skin, and she signed the marriage contract anyway. 3 days. Her husband had been in the ground exactly 3 days before Cornelius Vane's lawyer appeared at her door with a leather folder and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The debt was real. The deadline was real. And the stranger she was about to marry hadn't looked at her once since she walked into the room. She signed because she had no choice. She was wrong about that. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very end of this story. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Margaret's story travels. Now let's begin. The wedding lasted 14 minutes. Margaret counted them on the clock above the courthouse door in Red Mesa, New Mexico territory, because she needed something to look at that wasn't the face of the man standing beside her, or the faces of the people crowded into the hall who had come not to witness a marriage, but to watch a spectacle. She'd heard 2 women whispering before the justice of the peace even opened his book. 42 years old and widowed. What kind of woman lets her husband die and leave her with nothing but debts? The kind who couldn't keep him alive, I suppose. Margaret had kept her eyes forward and her hands still. The justice of the peace, a thin man named Horace Bidwell, who smelled of pipe tobacco and hurried everything he did, read the words from memory without looking up. "Elias Hargrove, do you take this woman?" Elias said, "I do," in the same voice a man uses to agree to unfavorable weather. Flat. Final. Something to be endured. "Margaret Calloway, do you take this man?" She said, "I do," and meant none of it, and felt no guilt about that. There was no music, no flowers. Cornelius Vane sat in the front row with his hands folded over his walking stick, and watched the whole proceeding with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a contract execute itself. He was 60 years old, and built like a man who had once been lean and let prosperity soften him. White-haired, pink-faced, wearing a suit that cost more than most families in Red Mesa spent on food in a year. When Margaret's eyes met his briefly across the room, he gave her a small nod, the kind a businessman gives when a transaction has gone smoothly. She looked away. Elias Hargrove signed the register without ceremony and stepped back from the table before Margaret had finished writing her new name. She watched his jaw set and his shoulders pull straight, the posture of a man bracing against something he'd agreed to and already regretted. He was younger than she'd expected when she'd first seen him in Vane's office 2 days ago. 34, maybe 35. Dark hair growing long at the collar. Eyes so dark they looked black in the courthouse light. He wore a vest the color of dried tobacco and a pistol on his right hip like it had always been there, like it was just another piece of his body. He hadn't spoken to her directly since they'd been introduced. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered on the steps parted for them with the particular kind of cruelty that passes itself off as amusement in small towns. Someone called out, "Better her than nobody, Hargrove." Someone else laughed. Margaret walked through it with her chin level and her hands at her sides, and did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had buried her husband 3 weeks ago in Missouri clay, packed everything she owned into 2 trunks, and ridden 3 days by rail and another day by wagon to reach a town she'd never seen to marry a man she didn't know. She was past the point where strangers laughing at her could break her composure. Elias's wagon was at the hitching post. He put her trunks in the back without asking and climbed to the seat and waited. Margaret climbed up herself without assistance and sat with 6 inches of air between them. They drove out of Red Mesa without speaking. The silence held for 20 minutes. Margaret spent it studying the land, because the land told you things people wouldn't. The grass was thin and pale, overgrazed and stressed by drought. The creek bed they crossed was barely running. The cattle she saw on distant slopes looked acceptable at first glance, but thin in the flank if you knew where to look. And she knew where to look. Her husband had been a physician, but before she married him, she had spent 8 years working her uncle's cattle operation in Kansas, because someone had to, and she was the only one who would. "You don't have to pretend to be interested," Elias said without looking at her. "I'm not pretending. Most people who come from the city look at land like it's scenery. I'm not from the city, and I'm looking at your cattle." He glanced at her sidelong. "What about them?" "The ones on the north slope are carrying less weight than they should for September. Either the grass is poor, or the feed's been poor, or both. You've also got a creek running low, which means your south pasture is probably drier than you want it this late in the year." A pause. "You know cattle." "I know land, I know numbers, and I know what a ranch looks like when it's been in trouble for more than one season." She folded her hands in her lap. "Yours has been in trouble for at least 2. Elias said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Vane said you were a doctor's wife." "I was. Before that, I was a rancher's niece who did his books and managed his contracts for 8 years while he took credit for it. Before that, I was my father's daughter, and my father believed that a woman who couldn't read a ledger was only half prepared for the world." She paused. He was right. "Vane said you needed help." "Vane said a great many things, I imagine. What exactly did he tell you about me?" Elias's hands tightened on the reins slightly, the only sign of discomfort he showed. "He said you were a widow with your husband's debts coming due. Said he'd arranged the marriage as a favor to your family. Said you'd be quiet and grateful and wouldn't make trouble." "He was right about one of those things." "Which one?" "I am a widow." The ranch house appeared at the end of a long drive, lined with fence posts that Margaret noted, without expression, were already beginning to split along the grain. Whoever had sold Elias Hargrove those posts had sold him inferior wood. She filed it without comment. Inside, the house was clean in the way a man's house is clean when he has kept it himself for years. Functional, stripped of anything unnecessary. Nothing on the walls, no curtains. A kitchen organized by logic rather than habit. A large desk in the main room was covered in papers. Margaret's eyes went to them immediately. "Your room is upstairs," Elias said. "Second door." "Our room." His expression went flat. "Mrs. Hargrove." "Margaret. And I understand this wasn't your choice any more than it was mine. But I'd like to understand what it is, if you don't mind. You said Vane arranged this as a favor. What exactly did that favor cost you?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, closer to exhaustion. "He cleared my outstanding debts to 3 suppliers. In exchange, I took you in." He said it plainly, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. "Took me in," Margaret repeated. "Like a stray." "That's not what I—" "No, it's an accurate description. He paid your debts, and you provided me with a home and a name. That's the arrangement." She set her traveling bag on the kitchen table and looked at him directly. "I'm not insulted by it, Mr. Hargrove. I agreed to it with clear eyes. What I am is practical. You have a ranch in trouble. I have skills that may be useful to you. Whether we treat this as a business arrangement or as something more is a conversation for later. For now, I'd like to see your ledgers." "My ledgers are private." "Your ledgers are half mine now. That's what the 14-minute ceremony this morning established." She held his gaze without blinking. "I'm not your enemy. The situation you're in is your enemy. Let me look at the books and tell you what I see." He stared at her for long enough that she thought he was going to refuse. Then he walked to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a bound ledger that he set on the table beside her bag. "Don't move anything," he said, and went outside. Margaret sat down and opened the ledger. She was thorough by nature and meticulous by training. She read the way her father had taught her to read financial records, not for the numbers themselves, but for the patterns, the gaps, the places where the math should work and didn't, the small inconsistencies that added up to something large when you laid them end to end. She went back 3 years. Then she went back further, to the secondary records she found tucked inside the back cover. Supply receipts and payment records and contracts written in a small, precise hand. By the time Elias came back in at dusk, she had 4 pages of notes and a cold, specific anger sitting in her chest. He looked at the notes. Then he looked at her face. "What? How long have you been purchasing feed and supplies from a company called Meridian Agricultural?" He thought about it. 2 years, maybe a little more. They came in when my previous supplier quit. Vane recommended them, said they offered fair pricing to struggling ranchers. They offered you prices that looked fair, 15 to 20% below what you'd have paid at open market. That's a good deal. It would be if the quality matched what you paid for. But look at this. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a sequence of entries. Your feed costs are reasonable, but your cattle weight gains are consistently below where they should be for the feed volume you're purchasing. That means either your cattle are sick, or the feed quality is poor, or you're receiving less than you're paying for, possibly all 3. Elias pulled up a chair and sat. He looked at the numbers with the careful attention of a man who had looked at them many times before, without seeing what she was seeing now. The cattle aren't sick. I had Doc Pierce check them in spring. Then the feed is poor, which means Meridian is selling you substandard product at below market prices, which sounds generous until you realize the substandard product is causing you to lose weight gain on your herd, which costs you far more in the long run than you're saving on the purchase price. She tapped the page. Who owns Meridian Agricultural? I never asked. A man named Aldridge manages the deliveries. Aldridge work for anyone in particular? Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said it slowly, like he was testing the weight of the word before committing to it. Vane. You're not sure? I'm not sure. Vane's got his hands in a lot of businesses around here. Half the suppliers in the territory have some connection to him. He paused. You think he's been selling me bad feed on purpose? I think that's one possibility. Margaret turned to the next page of her notes. This one troubles me more. These equipment contracts, the pump parts, the fencing materials, they're all serviced by a company called Mesa Hardware and Supply. Same arrangement as the feed. Below market pricing, and yet you're replacing parts 2 to 3 times more often than you should be based on normal wear rates. Equipment breaks down. It's ranch work. Not this often. Not this consistently. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Hargrove, in 8 years managing my uncle's operation, I replaced fence posts on the north section once. You've replaced yours twice in 18 months. Good posts don't split that fast. She paused. Who recommended Mesa Hardware? The color left his face in a slow, quiet way, like water draining from a basin. Vane. Yes. He stood up and moved to the window and stood there with his back to her. And she gave him the time he needed because it wasn't a small thing to realize that the man who had claimed to be your benefactor had spent 2 years, carefully, systematically, ruining you. She knew because she had sat in that same realization herself 3 weeks ago, looking at her late husband's accounts and understanding that the loan Vane had extended to cover the practice's slow months had terms that would have made it mathematically impossible to ever fully repay. She just hadn't said that to anyone yet. The debts he cleared, Elias said, without turning around. The ones he paid in exchange for the marriage. Those were debts to suppliers. Which suppliers? A pause. Meridian, Mesa Hardware. One other, a lumber company. Margaret set her pencil down. Do you know the name of the lumber company? Summit Timber, out of... He stopped. She watched his shoulders go rigid. Vane sits on the board of Summit Timber. I know that because I heard him mention it once and thought nothing of it at the time. He created your debts, Margaret said quietly. He did it slowly, through bad supplies and breakdowns and expenses that seemed like ordinary bad luck. And then, when you were desperate enough, he came in as the solution. He cleared debts that were owed to companies he controlled, using money that cost him very little. And in exchange, he gets... She stopped. Me, Elias said. He gets an arrangement where I owe him, where I'm grateful to him, where I'm not going to ask questions about the man who saved me. His voice was flat and very cold. And he gets you housed and quiet. He gets a woman who knows his accounting, placed in the situation where she has every reason to keep her mouth shut. Margaret picked up her pencil again. He thought a desperate widow would be too grateful to look closely at anything. Were you? Grateful? She thought about the day Vane's lawyer had appeared at her door in Missouri with the leather folder and the smooth, practiced explanation. About how he'd framed it as charity, as concern for the widow of a man the territory respected. About how she'd signed because her options had been precisely two: sign or face the debt collectors with nothing to offer them. I was scared, she said. That's not the same thing. Elias turned from the window. In the lamplight, his face looked older than 34, carved into harder lines than a man that age should have. What do we do with this? Right now, nothing. I have observations and patterns. I don't have proof. Proof requires documents, registrations, ownership records, the actual connection between Vane and these companies in writing. She organized her notes into a careful stack. I need to see your contracts, all of them. Every supply agreement, every loan document, every piece of paper that has a signature on it. That's a lot of paper. I read quickly. He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not hostility, something closer to recalibration. The look of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation he thought he already understood. Vane described you as a grieving woman who needed looking after. Vane describes everything in terms of what it needs from him. It's how he justifies what he takes. You figured all of this out in... He glanced at the clock. 3 hours. I figured out the pattern in 3 hours. The proof will take longer. She met his eyes. But it's there. Men like Vane are careful, but they're not careful enough because they don't expect anyone to look. They rely on people being too grateful or too afraid or too beaten down to examine the books closely. She paused. He picked the wrong widow. Something shifted in Elias Hargrove's expression. Just slightly. Just at the edges. I'm going to check the south pasture before dark, he said. The box on the left side of the desk. That's the contracts. You can go through it. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. Mr. Hargrove, he stopped. The fence posts on your south drive. Who supplied them? A silence. Mesa Hardware. They're going to fail before winter. I'd start looking for a different supplier now, before the first real storm. He put his hat on without answering and went out. But at the door, he paused with his hand on the frame, his back still to her, and said, My hands call me Elias. Then he was gone. Margaret pulled the contract box toward her and began to read. She worked by lamplight until well past midnight. The house was quiet around her, the kind of deep country quiet that felt like its own presence, broken only by the wind against the shutters and, once, the sound of Elias's boots on the porch when he came back from the pasture and went upstairs without speaking. She heard him stop on the landing for a moment, probably seeing the light still burning below. Then the floorboards moved again, and a door closed. The contracts told a story. It was not a complicated story once you knew how to read it, but it was buried carefully, distributed across dozens of documents in ways that looked routine. Purchase agreements with payment terms slightly tilted in the seller's favor. Equipment contracts with replacement clauses that made the buyer responsible for defective parts, meaning Elias had been paying to replace equipment that should never have failed in the first place. A loan document, the largest one, with an interest rate that looked reasonable in isolation, until you understood that the compounding schedule had been written to make the total balance grow faster than any normal payment plan could address. And on page 4 of that loan document, buried in language designed to look like standard legal boilerplate, Margaret found the clause that made her hand go still on the page. In the event of default on the principal balance, all land, livestock, and improvements associated with the Hargrove Ranch property, comprising 460 acres in the Red Mesa Territory, shall transfer in full to the designated holding entity of the lender, Vane Financial Trust, with no right of redemption or legal contest by the borrower or any party acting on the borrower's behalf. No right of redemption, no legal contest. She read it twice. Then she turned back to the front page and found the date the loan had been signed. 18 months ago. 2 months after the drought started. 1 month after Elias had first fallen behind on his supply payments to Meridian Agricultural and Mesa Hardware. Payments he'd fallen behind on because the suppliers Vane controlled had quietly raised their rates by 12% without notice. He'd been maneuvered into the loan, driven to it step by step, each step looking like ordinary misfortune, until the only door left open was the one Vane had been building toward all along. And the marriage. She thought about the marriage. A widow placed in the household of a man Vane already controlled through debt. A woman chosen for her situation rather than her character. A woman Vane had calculated would be too dependent, too frightened, too grateful to cause problems. She thought about the clause. No legal contest by the borrower or any party acting on the borrower's behalf. A wife was not a separate party. A wife, in the territory's legal framework, acted as an extension of her husband. Anything she found, anything she proved, could be challenged on the grounds that she had no independent standing. Vane had thought of that too. Margaret sat back in the chair and looked at the lamp and felt the specific quality of anger that comes not from being wronged, but from understanding, with complete clarity, exactly how you were wronged, and by whom, and why they thought they'd gotten away with it. He'd thought she would be grateful. He'd thought a widow who signed marriage papers with her hands shaking would spend the rest of her days being careful not to disturb the arrangement that kept her fed and housed. He'd put her in this house, in this situation, with this man, and he'd thought the story was finished. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. She was still at the desk when she heard Elias come downstairs at first light. He stopped in the doorway of the main room. He looked at the papers spread across the table, at the 4 pages of notes that had become 11, at the lamp that had burned down to its last quarter-inch of oil. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I found something." She looked up. "The loan document. The clause about default and transfer. Read page 4. He came to the table and picked up the contract and read. She watched his face as he read, the way his jaw set tighter with each line, the way his hands went still on the paper. He read it twice, the way she had, needing the second pass to be certain he hadn't misunderstood. Son of a... He stopped himself, set the contract down precisely, looked at her. He was never going to let me pay it off. Not with the compounding schedule he built into the terms, no. He set this whole thing up. From the beginning. From before the beginning. I think it started before the drought. I think the drought was convenient for him, but the plan was already in place. She turned to a page of her notes. Elias. Who else in this territory has lost land to Vane in the last 5 years? He thought about it. His face was doing something complicated, the look of a man rearranging everything he thought he knew about the last 2 years. 3 ranchers I can think of, maybe 4. Hadley lost his property east of town. The Brannigan family sold their place. Vane bought it at half value, said it was the only offer they'd get in a drought year. Old Pete Mossman. He stopped. Pete Mossman's loan was held by Vane Financial Trust. I remember because Pete mentioned it. Said he'd never heard of the trust before he signed. Vane Financial Trust, Margaret said carefully. Not Vane personally. A trust. Right. Which means when land transfers happen, they transfer to a legal entity, not to a named individual, which makes the paper trail harder to follow. She looked at him directly. He's been doing this for years. You're not the first. The weight of that settled over both of them. Outside, the sky was going from black to gray, and somewhere on the property, a rooster announced the fact with more enthusiasm than the moment warranted. We can't prove any of this, Elias said. Not with what we have here. Not yet. The documents that would prove it, the ownership records for Meridian, for Mesa Hardware, for Summit Timber, those would be in county filings. Registration papers, business licenses. He paused. Or in Vane's own records. Yes. We're not getting into Vane's records. No, but the county filings are public record. Anyone can request them. Margaret stood, stacking her notes into a careful order. I need to go into town. I'll go with you. A woman asking questions at the county clerk's office draws less attention than a man asking questions about his creditor's business holdings. Elias looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You've done this before. I have never done anything exactly like this before. She picked up her notes. But I've spent my entire adult life finding information that people assumed I wouldn't look for because they assumed I wasn't paying attention. People talk freely around women they've decided aren't dangerous. She met his eyes. Cornelius Vane made a very specific assumption about what kind of woman I am. And what kind of woman are you? Margaret Calloway picked up her coat from the back of the chair, tucked her notes into the inner pocket, and said, The kind he should have left alone. She walked out into the early morning light, and Elias Hargrove stood in the doorway of his house, watching her go. And for the first time since the debt had started piling up, and the land had started drying out, and the world had started narrowing to a single corridor with Vane's door at the end of it, he felt something that might, if conditions were right, eventually become hope. He went to put coffee on. There was a great deal of work ahead. The county clerk's office opened at 8 in the morning and smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the particular staleness of a room where important things were filed and rarely disturbed. The clerk was a young man named Harold, who wore his hair parted severely to one side, and looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who had been expecting a dull morning and was not disappointed by the sight of a woman in a dark traveling dress, asking politely about public business registrations. I'm looking for the ownership filings for several companies operating in the territory, Margaret said. Meridian Agricultural, Mesa Hardware and Supply, and Summit Timber. These would be business registration documents filed with the county? Harold blinked. Those are public record, ma'am, but they're not commonly requested. I imagine not. I'd still like to see them." He disappeared into the back room with the shuffling reluctance of someone being asked to do actual work before 9 in the morning. Margaret stood at the counter and kept her expression pleasant and her hands still. Through the window, she could see the main street of Red Mesa beginning its morning business. Wagons pulling up to storefronts, men gathering outside the saloon that wouldn't open for another 3 hours, but already had 2 dedicated optimists waiting on the steps. She saw Cornelius Vane's carriage parked in front of the bank across the street. It was a fine carriage, black with brass fittings, the kind designed to be noticed. She had already noticed it. Harold came back with 3 folders and set them on the counter with a thump that suggested they were heavier than he'd expected. "Registration papers for all 3. Is there anything specific you're looking for?" "Just reviewing. Thank you, Harold." He retreated to his desk. Margaret opened the first folder. Meridian Agricultural. Registered 18 months ago, 2 months before Elias had first started purchasing from them. Primary business address listed as a post office box in Santa Fe. Registered agent of record listed as one Thomas Aldridge. She turned to the second page. Beneficial owner of record. The line was blank. She looked at it for a moment, then opened the second folder. Mesa Hardware and Supply. Registered 22 months ago. Same Santa Fe post office box. Same registered agent, Thomas Aldridge. Beneficial owner of record. Blank. Summit Timber. Same story. Aldridge's name on every line that required a name, and nothing, carefully, deliberately nothing, on the lines that would have named who actually owned and profited from these businesses. She closed the folders and stood quietly for a moment, thinking. Blank lines in business registrations were not illegal. They were, however, unusual in a territory where most businesses were registered by the people who owned them, because most people in the territory didn't know there was another way to do it. The fact that all 3 companies had used the same method, the same registered agent, the same mailing address, and filed within months of each other, suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. "Harold," she said, "is there a way to search filings by registered agent? I'd like to see everything in the county record that lists Thomas Aldridge as agent." Harold looked up from his ledger with an expression that suggested this was a more interesting question than he'd expected from her. "That would take some time." "I have time." It took 40 minutes. Harold brought her a list of 11 companies, all with the same Santa Fe address, all with Aldridge's name and blank beneficial ownership lines. 11 companies. She recognized 4 of the names from Elias's contracts. The other 7 she wrote down carefully and folded the paper into her coat pocket. She thanked Harold, who seemed genuinely uncertain what to make of her, and walked out into the morning. Dorothy Finch's general store was 3 buildings down from the clerk's office. Margaret had met Dorothy briefly on her arrival in Red Mesa 2 days ago, long enough to form the impression of a woman who had survived a great deal by being more observant than she let on. She pushed open the door, and the bell above it rang, and Dorothy looked up from behind the counter with the careful neutrality of someone deciding in real time what they thought about a visitor. "Mrs. Hargrove," Dorothy said. "Didn't expect to see you in town so soon." "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to know before I do that I'm not asking idly." Dorothy's eyes sharpened slightly. "All right." "Thomas Aldridge. What do you know about him?" A pause. Dorothy set down the jar she'd been holding, with the deliberate care of someone buying herself a moment to think. "He manages deliveries for several of Vane's supplier companies. Comes through maybe once a month. Quiet man. Efficient. He's the registered agent of record for 11 separate businesses all operating in this territory. Does he strike you as a man who owns 11 businesses?" Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "He strikes me as a man who does what he's told." "That's what I thought." Margaret pulled out her list of company names and set it on the counter. Do you recognize these? The ones I've circled. Dorothy studied the list. Her face didn't change much, but something behind her eyes did. The slow movement of a woman connecting things she'd kept carefully separate. Henderson Grain. Yes, I know them. They bought out old Cal Morrison's operation 3 years back. Cal said it was a fair price, but he looked like a man who'd been told to say something was fair. She pointed to another name. Red Rock Cattle Brokerage. They hold the exclusive purchasing contract for half the ranches in this county. Any rancher who wants to sell has to go through them. And what do they pay? Below market. Always a reason for it. Drought, demand down, shipping costs up. Dorothy's voice had gone flat. There's always a reason. There's always a reason Vane provides, Margaret said. The silence in the store was the particular kind that happens when someone says something both people have been circling around without saying. Dorothy pulled the list closer and looked at it more carefully, and Margaret watched the older woman's face do the work of rearranging things she thought she'd understood. How long have you known, Margaret asked, that Vane controls most of the territory supply chain? I've suspected for years. Dorothy's jaw tightened. Suspecting and being able to prove are different things. And even if you could prove it, who do you take it to? The sheriff answers to the county, and the county commissioners have been eating at Vane's table since before I opened this store. She paused. What are you planning to do? I'm planning to find proof that connects Aldridge to Vane directly. Business documents, bank transfers, anything with both names on it. Margaret folded the list and put it back in her pocket. I'm also looking for anyone who might have worked for Vane's operation closely enough to know how it's structured. Someone who's since left. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She moved to the window that faced the street, stood with her arms crossed, looking out at nothing in particular. There was a man, she said slowly. Jerome Pike. He kept books for Vane for about 3 years. Left maybe 8 months ago. He came into the store one morning to buy supplies for a trip south, and I asked him where he was headed, and he said, somewhere Vane couldn't find him. She paused. He had the look of a man who'd seen something he couldn't unsee. Do you know where he went? I heard he ended up in Cimarron. His cousin has a spread out that way. Dorothy turned from the window. He won't want to talk, Margaret. Whatever he knows, it scared him enough to run 60 miles. I know. Margaret picked up her bag. But angry men and scared men are two different problems. I'd rather deal with scared. She was halfway to the door when Dorothy said, Margaret? She stopped. Dorothy was looking at her with an expression that was not quite warmth, but was the precursor to it. The look of a woman deciding to trust something she hadn't decided to trust yet. Vane is going to find out you've been in the clerk's office asking questions. Harold isn't malicious, but he talks. By this afternoon, someone will have mentioned it. She paused. Be careful about what you say to your husband's foreman. Why? Because Cole Briggs has been on Vane's payroll since before Elias hired him. Margaret absorbed that without visible reaction. Thank you, she said, and meant it fully. She walked back to where she'd left the horse and stood for a moment with her hand on the saddle, looking across the street at Vane's carriage. It was still there. As she watched, Vane himself came out of the bank, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere to be and everywhere to be at once. He was talking to the bank manager, a wiry man named Sutton, who nodded at everything Vane said with the vigorous agreement of someone afraid to do otherwise. Vane's eyes found her across the street. He stopped talking. He looked at her with an expression of measured pleasantness that did not quite reach his eyes, and he touched the brim of his hat. Margaret held his gaze and did not touch her hat, because she wasn't wearing one, and did not smile, because she wasn't feeling one. Then she mounted and rode back toward the ranch. Elias was in the south pasture when she got back, on horseback, moving along the fence line with the practiced attention of a man checking for damage after a night of wind. She rode out to meet him rather than waiting at the house, because what she had to tell him was not the kind of thing that benefited from sitting on. He pulled up when he saw her coming, read something in her face before she spoke. "What did you find?" 11 companies, all registered the same way, all connected to a single agent who works for Vane. I can't prove Vane owns them directly because the beneficial ownership lines are blank, but the pattern is clear enough. She paused. There's a man named Jerome Pike who used to keep Vane's books. He's in Cimarron now. He left because he found out something he wasn't supposed to find out. Cimarron is a day's ride. Yes. Elias looked at the fence line. Cole Briggs has been with me 2 years. I know. Dorothy told you. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of a man absorbing a betrayal that he was going to have to decide how to handle. 2 years I trusted that man with my operation. Vane places people carefully. It's part of how the system works. He doesn't need to watch every ranch himself if someone inside is watching for him. Margaret kept her voice even. Don't let Briggs know you're aware of it. Not yet. If he reports to Vane that we're asking questions, Vane will know we're onto him. Right now, our only advantage is that he thinks I'm a grieving widow who signs papers and keeps quiet. Elias looked at her with that recalibrating expression she was beginning to recognize. You think like a general. I think like a woman who spent 20 years being underestimated. It teaches you to plan 3 moves ahead. She met his eyes. I need to ride to Cimarron. I need to talk to Pike. Not alone. I'm harder to dismiss alone. A woman traveling with a man looks like she's being escorted. A woman traveling alone looks like she has business. A woman traveling alone in this territory looks like a target. They looked at each other for a moment, the particular stalemate of 2 people who are each correct. Tomorrow morning, Elias said, we go together. We tell Briggs we're visiting a stock supplier. It's not even a full lie. He paused. Tonight, I want you to look at something in the barn. The feed storage was along the barn's north wall, 6 large bins holding the winter supply. Elias opened the first bin, and Margaret leaned in and smelled it before she saw it. The particular sour, heavy smell of grain that has been compromised by moisture. She reached in and brought out a handful. It crumbled at the edges, the interior dark. When did this arrive? She asked. 3 weeks ago. Meridian's monthly delivery. Aldridge brought it himself, which he doesn't usually do. Elias's voice was controlled and very cold. Certified it as Grade A winter feed. It's not Grade A anything. How much of it is like this? I don't know yet. I only opened this bin an hour ago. He looked at the wall of storage bins. If it's all like this, your cattle won't have adequate nutrition through winter, which means they'll lose weight, which means you can't make your sale weight thresholds, which means you can't make your loan payment. Margaret set the ruined grain back in the bin and brushed her hands on her skirt. When is your next payment due? 6 weeks. And how close are the cattle to sale weight now? 30 pounds under threshold. With good feed, they'd make it in 8 weeks. With this, he gestured at the bins. They won't make it at all. Margaret stood straight and looked at him. This is deliberate. The timing is too precise. Bad feed arrives 6 weeks before your payment deadline, exactly when your cattle need to be gaining weight for fall sales. She paused. He's accelerating. Something's changed in his timeline. What would change it? Us. The marriage. She thought it through as she spoke. Vane placed me here assuming I'd be manageable, but someone saw me going into the clerk's office this morning. If that gets back to him, and Dorothy said it will, he'll know I'm not manageable, which means he'll move faster before I find what I'm looking for. Elias closed the bin. He stood with his hand on the lid for a moment, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic she was doing. The brutal math of 6 weeks and 30 pounds, and a loan document with no right of redemption. "If we can't make the payment," he said, "he takes everything. The land, the cattle, whatever's left."
"Yes. And you." She looked at him. He said it plainly, not dramatically, just as another fact in the ledger of facts they were assembling together. The clause about no legal contest covers the borrower and any party acting on his behalf. If you're legally my wife and I default, your standing to challenge anything is gone too. I know. She had known since she read the clause at 2 a.m. by the dying lamp. Which is why we can't let the payment deadline pass without resolving this. 6 weeks isn't enough time to build a legal case against Vane. It might not be enough time for the courts. It might be enough time for the town. She looked at him steadily. Vane's power depends on no one understanding the whole picture. Every rancher who's lost land thinks it was their own failure. Every supplier who works for him thinks they're working for an independent business. The people who know the truth are either gone, like Pike, or scared into silence. She paused.
But if we can show people the full picture all at once, not a rumor here and a suspicion there, but documented evidence laid out where everyone can see it, his power breaks. Because his power is built on isolation, on each person thinking they're the only one he's done this to. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, pushing dry leaves across the yard with a sound like whispered argument. "You've been planning this since this morning," he said. "I've been planning this since I read the loan document at 2 a.m, she said. "I just needed to know if there were enough other people to make it work." "Are there?" "There are 11 companies. That means at least 11 ranchers or suppliers who've been on the receiving end of what was done to you. If even half of them are willing to stand up." She stopped, looked at the storage bins. "We need Pike. His record's of the thread that ties it all together." Elias put his hat back on and looked at the sky, reading the weather the way people who live by land learn to read it. "We leave at first light," he said. "Tell Briggs we need parts from a supplier in Cimarron. He'll report it to Vane, and that's fine. Let Vane think it's a supply run. And if Pike won't talk? Then we find another way." He turned toward the house. "You should eat something. You've been running on nothing since yesterday." It was the most domestic thing he'd said to her, and it caught her slightly off guard. "I'm fine." Mrs. Hargrove. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who has decided to be firm about something small, because the large things are entirely out of his control. "You sat up all night reading contracts, and rode into town before breakfast, and have been turning over a conspiracy all morning. Eat something." She almost said something sharp. Instead, she looked at his face and saw, underneath the flatness, something that was not quite concern, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who had decided, without announcing the decision, that her well-being was now something he was paying attention to. "All right," she said. They walked back to the house together through the rising wind, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was different from the silence on the wagon ride the day before. Less like distance, more like two people thinking about the same problem from the same side. Inside, Elias put a pan on the stove, and Margaret sat at the table with her notes spread in front of her, and added what Dorothy had told her and what Harold's files had shown, building the picture carefully, the way her father had taught her to build an argument. Not from the conclusion backward, but from the evidence forward, piece by piece, until the conclusion couldn't be avoided. She was still writing when Elias set a plate in front of her without comment and went to the window to watch the wind work at the fence line. She ate without stopping her work. And somewhere across town, in the office above the bank, Cornelius Vane was reading a note that Harold the clerk had sent over with a boy, and his expression, which was normally as composed as a man who expects to win everything, had shifted into something that looked very much like the first edge of anger. They left before sunrise. Elias told Cole Briggs they needed to inspect a livestock supplier in Cimarron, kept his voice flat and his face neutral, gave nothing away. Briggs nodded and said he'd handled the morning feeding, and Margaret watched the foreman's eyes from 20 feet away and saw the small, careful attention in them, the look of a man filing information, rather than simply receiving it. She said nothing until they were a mile down the road, with the ranch behind them, and the sky just beginning to go gray at the eastern edge. "He'll send word to Vane before we're out of sight of the property," she said. "I know." Elias kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Let him. If Vane thinks we're chasing a supply problem, he'll spend the morning feeling comfortable. Comfortable men don't move fast." "And if Vane figures out where we're actually going?" "Then we'd better find Pike first." The road to Cimarron ran southeast through open country that had been beaten hard by 2 years of drought. They rode without unnecessary conversation, which Margaret had come to understand was not unfriendliness on Elias's part, but simply how he moved through the world, efficiently, without decoration. She found she didn't mind it. She had spent enough years in rooms full of men who talked loudly to cover the absence of thought. Quiet felt honest by comparison. She used the ride to think about Jerome Pike. Dorothy had said he was scared. Scared men were manageable if you understood what they were scared of. If Pike had left Vane's employment 8 months ago and run 60 miles, rather than simply resigning and staying in Red Mesa, then what he knew was significant enough that he'd calculated Vane might silence him rather than simply let him go. That meant Pike wasn't just a disgruntled bookkeeper with vague suspicions. He had something specific, something documented. The question was whether fear would keep him from using it, or whether the right argument could tip the balance. They reached Cimarron by mid-morning. It was smaller than Red Mesa, a cattle town built around a single commercial street and a railroad depot that had seen better years. Elias asked at the depot for a man named Pike, or a family named Pike, with a cousin's spread nearby. And the station master, after looking them over with the frank assessment of a man accustomed to sizing up strangers, said there was a Pike family at a ranch called the Double Creek, about 4 miles east. The man who answered the door of the Double Creek ranch house was not what Margaret had expected. She had imagined someone physically diminished by fear, hollowed out by it. Jerome Pike was instead a compact, precise-looking man in his mid-30s, with ink-stained fingers and the straight posture of someone who had spent years at a desk. His eyes went to Margaret first, then to Elias, then back to Margaret with the rapid assessment of a man who had been watching doors for 8 months. "I don't know you," he said. "My name is Margaret Hargrove. I married Elias Hargrove of Red Mesa 6 days ago." She kept her voice even. "We're not here because Vane sent us. We're here because we found the blank lines in 11 business registrations and a loan document with a no-contest clause, and we need to understand how the structure works before we can dismantle it." Pike's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Who told you about me?" "Dorothy Finch." Something shifted in his face at Dorothy's name. Not relaxation exactly, but the slight reduction of a held breath. "Dorothy's a good woman," he said. Then, after a pause, "You'd better come in." The inside of the ranch house was spare and organized, and on the kitchen table, as though he'd been working on them when they knocked, were ledgers. Open ones. Margaret looked at them and looked at Pike, and understood that this was a man who had been sitting 60 miles away from the problem for 8 months and had not been able to stop thinking about it. "You've been preparing," she said. "I've been trying to work up the nerve," Pike said. He didn't sit. He stood on the other side of the table with his arms crossed, looking at them with an expression that was equal parts wariness and something that might have been desperate relief at having someone to talk to. "I left because I thought leaving would be enough. I thought if I was far enough away and quiet enough, he'd leave me alone." "Has he?" "So far. But I know it's only because I haven't done anything with what I know." He looked at the ledgers on the table. "The moment I try to use any of this, I become a problem he needs to solve." "You're already a problem he needs to solve," Elias said, not unkindly. "A man who runs from his employer and takes copies of the books with him? Vane knows what that means. The only question is whether he moves against you before you move against him." Pike's jaw worked. "That's not a comforting assessment." "It's an accurate one," Margaret said. "Mr. Pike, I've looked at the registration documents for the company's Vane controls in Red Mesa. The beneficial ownership lines are blank. His name doesn't appear anywhere in the public filings. Thomas Aldridge's name appears everywhere, but Aldridge is a manager, not an owner. What I need is the documentation that connects Vane directly to ownership of these businesses. Not a pattern of circumstance, but an actual paper trail with his name on it." Pike looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, the movement of a man making a decision he'd been putting off for months. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Pike opened the top ledger and turned it to face them. "When I first started working for Vane, I thought I was keeping books for a legitimate holding company, Vane Financial Trust, which held investments in various regional businesses. Standard stuff. I was good at it, and he paid well." He turned to a marked page. 6 months in, I started noticing patterns, payments flowing between accounts in ways that didn't match the business explanations I was given. A supplier company receiving a payment labeled as operational expense, and then 3 days later, that same amount appearing in a Vane Financial Trust account labeled as investment return. "He was paying himself," Margaret said. "Through the supplier companies, yes. But it was more than that." Pike turned to another page. The supplier companies weren't just holding companies for profit. They were instruments. He'd set them up specifically to do business with ranchers he'd identified as targets. Ranchers with drought problems, debt problems, land he wanted. He'd offer below-market pricing through these companies, get the ranchers locked into contracts, and then systematically degrade the product quality. Bad feed, inferior materials. The ranchers would lose productivity without understanding why. Their debt would grow. And then Vane would appear as the solution. "The loan," Elias said. "The loan was always the last step. By the time he offered it, the target was desperate enough to sign anything. And the no-contest clause made sure that once they signed, there was no legal path back." Pike looked at Elias with an expression that was close to apology. "I recognized your name in the files 8 months ago. You were already 2 steps into the process." Elias said nothing. His hands were flat on the table and very still, the posture of a man maintaining control through deliberate physical discipline. "How many ranchers?" Margaret asked. "In Red Mesa territory?" 11 completed transactions in the last 5 years, meaning 11 properties transferred to Vane Financial Trust through foreclosure or distressed sale. Another 7 currently in process at various stages. Pike turned to a page near the back of the ledger. "Your husband's property was the largest single target. Vane wants it specifically because the water rights attached to the Hargrove land cover the eastern aquifer access. Control that, and he controls water rights for 1/3 of the territory." The air in the room went very still. Margaret looked at Elias and saw the moment he understood that this had never been about the loan, or the drought, or the debt. It had always been about water. In a drought territory, water was not just a resource. It was a lever that could move everything else. "He needs my land," Elias said slowly, "because whoever controls the eastern aquifer controls who survives the drought and who doesn't." "And what they pay to survive," Margaret said. "He's not just building a land empire. He's building a monopoly on survival." She looked at Pike. "Does he know how much you took when you left?" "I took copies. I left the originals." Pike's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "He knows I'm a risk. He also knows that what I have is inadmissible unless I'm willing to testify. And testifying means standing up in a courtroom in this territory and calling Cornelius Vane a criminal in front of a judge who has eaten at Vane's table." "Not a courtroom," Margaret said. "Not yet." Both men looked at her. She had been building the shape of this in her mind for 2 days, arranging the pieces the way her father had taught her to arrange an argument, finding the single point where every line of force converged. The courts were slow, and Vane owned too much of the legal machinery in the territory. The county commissioners were compromised. The sheriff was a question she hadn't yet answered. But there was one venue where Vane's money and lawyers and influence meant less than it did anywhere else, where public knowledge operated faster than legal process, where the isolation he depended on could be broken all at once. "The Stockmen's Association meeting," she said.
"When is it?" Elias looked at her.
2 weeks. They hold it quarterly at the Redstone Hotel.
"Who attends?"
Every rancher in the territory with a significant operation. It's where they negotiate collective pricing for cattle sales, coordinate on water use, discuss shared problems.
"And Vane attends?"
He sits on the association's board, has for 12 years. Margaret turned to Pike.
"If we present your documentation at that meeting, in front of every rancher in the territory, simultaneously, Vane can't suppress it. He can't buy the silence of 30 people at once. He can't threaten everyone in the room before they've compared notes with their neighbors." She paused. "His entire system depends on each person believing they're alone in what happened to them. Take that away, and the system breaks."
Pike stared at her. "That meeting is 2 weeks from now."
"Yes."
"You want me to stand up in front of Cornelius Vane and every influential man in this territory and accuse him of systematic fraud? I want you to show them your ledgers and let the numbers do the accusing. You don't have to say a single inflammatory word. You just have to be willing to be in the room." She met his eyes. "You've been sitting here for 8 months with the truth in a stack of ledgers and no way to use it safely. This is the way." Pike looked at his hands. He looked at the ledgers. He had the expression of a man who had told himself a very specific story about why he couldn't act, and was now watching that story come apart under the pressure of someone who wouldn't accept it. "Vane will know it was me," he said. "The moment those numbers appear in public, he'll know exactly where they came from."
"He already knows," Elias said. "You said it yourself. You're already a problem he hasn't decided how to handle yet."
This doesn't change that calculation. It just determines whether you use that time or whether he does. The silence stretched. Through the window, the morning had moved to full daylight. The sky the particular hard blue of a drought country without clouds. "I need to think," Pike said.
"You have until we finish this conversation," Margaret said. Not unkindly, but without softness either. "Because when we ride back to Red Mesa, Briggs is going to report to Vane that we came to Cimarron. Vane will ask questions about what business could bring us here. He knows you're in Cimarron, Mr. Pike. It won't take him long to make the connection." She leaned forward slightly. "The window for you to choose this on your own terms is today. Tomorrow, it may be his choice." Pike pushed back from the table and stood and walked to the window and stood there with his back to them. His shoulders were tight.
the posture of a man in an argument with himself, that he was losing. Margaret waited. She had learned, in years of negotiating contracts on her uncle's behalf and explaining accounts to men who didn't want to hear what the numbers said, that the most important moment in any conversation was the silence after you'd made the argument and before the other person had decided what to do with it. Filling that silence was always a mistake. Elias seemed to understand this too, because he sat quietly, with his hat on the table, and watched Pike's back without speaking. After a long moment, Pike said, "Dorothy really sent you?" "She told us where to find you," Margaret said. "She also told us you were scared but angry. She said angry men sometimes do brave things." Pike made a sound that might have been a short, humorless laugh. Dorothy always did understand people better than they understood themselves. He turned around. His face had settled into something that was not quite resolution, but was the decision to move toward it. The ledgers cover 6 years of transactions. I organize them by company and by rancher target, so the pattern is clear even to someone who doesn't know accounting. I also have the trust registration documents, the ones that actually show Vane as the beneficial owner of the holding company that controls the subsidiaries. He made me file them when the trust was first set up. I kept copies. Margaret felt something move in her chest that she didn't fully have a name for. Something between relief and the particular satisfaction that comes from a calculation proving out. "Those documents are the thread," she said. "Everything else supports them, but those are the proof." "I know." Pike crossed back to the table and sat down. "I'll come to Red Mesa. I'll bring everything." He looked at Elias. "I'm sorry I didn't act sooner. I kept telling myself someone else would figure it out. Someone with more standing, more resources. Someone who wouldn't lose as much as I would." "You're acting now," Elias said. "Because she made it impossible not to." Pike looked at Margaret with an expression that was direct and slightly rueful. The look of a man who has just had his own reasoning taken apart by someone more precise than himself. "How long have you been doing this?" "Doing what?" "Walking into rooms where people have decided you're not a threat and leaving with everything you needed." Margaret picked up her gloves from the table. "Long enough to be good at it," she said. "Bring the trust registration documents. Everything else, but those especially. And Pike," she paused, "don't tell anyone you're coming. Not your cousin, not anyone who might mention it in passing to the wrong person. Pack what you need, settle whatever you need to settle here, and ride to Red Mesa in 3 days. Come to the ranch directly, not through town." "3 days," he said, as though measuring the weight of it. 3 days. She stood. "Vane is going to move when he figures out we're not running from him. We need to move first." They rode back toward Red Mesa through the afternoon heat, and for the first 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Elias said, 2 weeks to prepare for a public confrontation with the most powerful man in the territory?" "Yes. And we're trusting a man who ran away once already?" "He didn't run from conviction. He ran from isolation. That's different." Margaret looked at the road ahead. "He's been alone with this for 8 months, Pike has. That does something to a person. It makes the thing feel larger than it is because there's no one to help you carry the weight of knowing it." She paused. "He won't run again. He's been waiting for someone to make the next move possible." Elias was quiet for a moment. "And if Vane moves against us before the meeting?" "Then we adjust." She glanced at him. "You're not a man who gives up when the plan changes. I can see that. You've known me 6 days. I've read your contracts, your accounts, and your feed records. I know how you've responded to every setback for 3 years. You improvise. You don't quit." She turned her eyes back to the road. "That's enough to work with." He didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. A quieter register, less guarded. What made you read people this way? The way you read Pike, the way you read Dorothy. It's not just accounting. My father used to say that numbers don't lie, but people who present numbers always do, either to others or to themselves. If you want to understand the numbers, understand the person presenting them first. She paused. I've spent my life being the person in the room who was supposed to be decorative. It teaches you to pay attention to everything, because no one's watching you, watch them. Elias said nothing, but she felt the shift beside her, the slight reorientation of a man revising an understanding he'd been forming, and finding it needed to be larger than he'd made it. They rode on into the late afternoon, and the ranch appeared in the distance with the smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight in the windless air, and Margaret looked at it with a strange doubled sensation she'd had since arriving. The awareness that this was not her home, and the equally present awareness that she was going to fight for it as though it was. At the gate, Elias pulled up. Cole Briggs was coming out of the barn, and Elias watched him for a moment with the carefully neutral face of a man who has been betrayed and has decided to keep that information as a tool, rather than spend it as an emotion. "Good trip," Briggs called. "Productive," Elias said. "Get the evening feeding done early. I want to talk to the hands after supper." Briggs nodded and went back into the barn, and Elias and Margaret dismounted without looking at each other and walked toward the house. And between them, the shape of what had to happen in 2 weeks was as present and heavy as a third person walking alongside them. Inside, Margaret sat at the desk and opened her notes, and Elias stood at the stove and put coffee on. And somewhere across the territory, Cornelius Vane was reading a report from a man he paid in Cimarron, and his expression was no longer the comfortable satisfaction of a man watching a contract execute itself. It was something colder and more alert. He had underestimated the widow. He would not make that mistake again. Pike arrived in 2 days instead of 3, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how frightened he'd become after they left. She was at the desk reviewing contracts when she heard hoofbeats in the yard and looked out to see a horse coming in hard, the rider leaning forward with the urgency of someone who had ridden the last miles faster than was comfortable. Elias was out of the barn before Pike had fully dismounted, and Margaret was through the door 30 seconds later. Pike's face was gray with dust and something else. "Someone followed me out of Cimarron," he said. "2 men. I lost them at the canyon fork south of town, but they know the direction I was heading." Elias took the horse's reins. "Vane's men?" "I don't know who else it would be." Pike pulled a leather satchel from his saddlebag and held it against his chest with both arms, the way a man holds something he's afraid of losing. "I rode through the night. I didn't stop." Margaret put her hand on his arm briefly, the gesture of a woman who understood what it cost to make a decision and then commit to it fully before the fear caught up. "You're here. Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, and Pike opened the satchel and laid out its contents with the careful precision of a man who had organized these documents so many times in his head that his hands moved automatically. Ledgers, correspondence, and at the bottom of the stack, a set of papers with an official seal that made Margaret's breath catch. "The trust registration," she said, "filed 3 years ago in Santa Fe. Cornelius Vane, listed as sole beneficiary of Vane Financial Trust." Pike's finger moved down the page. "And here, the trust's registered holdings: Meridian Agricultural, Mesa Hardware and Supply, Summit Timber, Henderson Grain, Red Rock Cattle Brokerage." He looked up. "Every company on your list." Margaret spread the papers on the table and looked at them with the concentrated attention she usually reserved for financial discrepancies, reading every line twice, tracing the structure. It was clean. It was documented. It was, in the language of legal evidence, bulletproof. His name, his signature, his company's, all of it notarized and officially filed. Because when Vane had set the trust up 3 years ago, he had not yet imagined that the person who filed his paperwork would be sitting across a kitchen table in a ranch house 60 miles away, handing copies to the wife of a man he was in the process of destroying. "You filed these yourself?" she asked Pike. "He sent me to Santa Fe specifically. Said it was cleaner to have the trust formalized through proper channels." Pike's voice had the flat quality of a man recounting something he'd replayed too many times. "I think he chose me because I was new, and he hadn't fully assessed what I'd do with what I knew. By the time he understood I was paying attention, I was already gone." "He underestimated you the same way he underestimated me," Margaret said. "The difference is, you came back to fight. I ran."
"You're here now," Elias said from the doorway. He came in and sat down and looked at the papers on the table, with the expression she had come to recognize as his thinking face. Still, directed, the outward composure of a man running rapid calculations underneath. "The meeting is in 12 days. Can we keep this quiet for 12 days? "Not if Vane's men track Pike here," Margaret said. "He'll know we have the documents, which means he'll move before we can present them." The sound came without warning, hoofbeats in the yard again. But this time not a single rider. Multiple horses, moving at a controlled pace that was more deliberate than urgent. The sound of men who had arrived with a purpose and were not in a hurry because they believed they had the advantage. Elias was on his feet before Margaret finished the thought. "Get the papers," he said to Pike. "All of them. Back bedroom, under the floorboard on the left side of the window. Go." Pike gathered the documents with hands that were not entirely steady and disappeared down the hall. Margaret stood and smoothed her dress and looked at Elias. "Let me do the talking," she said. "Margaret, he came to intimidate you. A man defending his home looks frightened. A woman asking polite questions looks like an obstacle he hasn't accounted for." She held his gaze. "Trust me." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "All right," he said. They went out together. Cornelius Vane was dismounting from his carriage with the unhurried ease of a man who owned the ground he stood on and wanted you to understand that. 4 riders came with him this time, all armed, positioned with the casual deliberateness of men who had done this before. Cole Briggs stood by the barn, and the fact that he did not look surprised told Margaret everything about the timing of Vane's arrival. "Mrs. Hargrove," Vane said, with the warm smile of a man performing warmth for an audience he believed he controlled. "I heard you were in Cimarron. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything's fine," Margaret said pleasantly. "We were looking at feed suppliers. The last delivery from Meridian was substandard." Something moved in Vane's eyes, quick and cold, before the smile reasserted itself. "I'm sorry to hear that. I'll speak to Aldridge." "That would be helpful. We've had some concerns about quality control across several of the suppliers we're working with." She kept her voice conversational, the tone of a woman discussing household management. "It's made us think we should diversify, reduce dependence on any single source." "That's understandable." Vane moved toward the porch, with the presumption of a man who expects to be invited in. "May I come inside? I have a matter I'd like to discuss with Elias." "Of course," Margaret said, and stepped aside. Inside, she put coffee on without being asked and stood at the stove while Vane settled into a chair at the kitchen table with the comfortable authority of a man who considers every room his room. His eyes moved over the table surface, the desk, the walls, cataloging and finding nothing. "I'll come to the point," Vane said, looking at Elias. "I've had some concerns about your operation. The feed situation you mentioned, the difficulty with cattle weight. These things suggest you may be heading toward a difficult season. I want to help.
You've helped considerably already, Elias said. His voice was level. I'd like to do more. Vane reached into his coat and produced a folded document. I'm prepared to extend your loan terms by 6 months. Push the payment deadline to spring. Give you time to get the cattle to weight and make a proper sale. He set the document on the table. All I ask in return is a modest adjustment to the water rights agreement attached to the original loan. Margaret turned from the stove and looked at the document. She did not touch it. What adjustment? Vane glanced at her with the particular look of a man who finds a question irritating but must manage the irritation. A temporary easement on the eastern aquifer access, just through the drought period. Temporary, she said. 6 months, 12 at most, until the water table recovers. She looked at the document. Easements were not temporary in any legal framework she had ever encountered. An easement, once granted and recorded, required both parties to agree to its removal. And if one party happened to go through foreclosure in the interim, the easement would transfer with the land and become permanent. That's very generous, she said, and her voice was so completely neutral that Elias, who had learned in 10 days to read her subtle signals, glanced at her with one brief question in his eyes. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. I think of it as protecting my investment, Vane said smoothly. Your ranch is valuable to the territory. I'd hate to see it fail over a temporary cash problem. We appreciate your concern, Margaret said. She set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from Vane, which put her directly in his line of sight and positioned her as a participant in the conversation, rather than a presence to be managed. Can I ask what prompted the visit today specifically? You could have sent this document through your lawyer. Vane's smile did not change. I prefer to conduct important conversations in person. So do I. She folded her hands on the table. Mr. Vane, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Is Thomas Aldridge an independent businessman, or does he work for you? The room went very still. Not the dramatic stillness of a confrontation, but the particular stillness that happens when a question lands that someone was not prepared for, no matter how prepared they thought they were. Aldridge manages several supplier relationships on a consulting basis, Vane said after a beat that was 1 beat too long. I've engaged his services, yes, as have many businesses in the territory. So, when Meridian Agricultural sells substandard feed to ranchers in this county, and Aldridge is the man who certified the quality and delivered the product, and you are among the businesses that engage Aldridge's services, you'd say that's all coincidental. I'd say that's an uncharitable interpretation of a business relationship. I'd say it's a factual description. She kept her voice pleasant. I'd also say that the loan document my husband signed 18 months ago has an interest compounding schedule that was designed to make repayment mathematically impossible within the stated term, and that the no contest clause in the default provisions would prevent any legal challenge to a foreclosure, which is an unusual set of terms for a loan made to a neighbor out of neighborly concern. Vane was looking at her now with an attention that had nothing in it of the comfortable dismissal with which he'd walked through the door. She had seen this look before, on other men, in other rooms. The recalculation that happens when someone realizes they have been misled about the nature of the conversation they're in. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, and his voice had changed register, the warmth setting aside like a jacket he no longer needed. You've been married to this man for 10 days. I'd encourage you to be careful about forming strong opinions on complex business matters you may not fully understand. I understand numbers, she said. I've understood them since I was 16. I understand that 11 ranching operations in this territory have transferred to Vane Financial Trust in the last 5 years. and that in each case, the transfer followed a period of supply problems, equipment failures, and debt accumulation that can be traced back to companies you control. She paused. I also understand water rights. And I understand that the eastern aquifer access attached to this property is worth considerably more than the loan you're proposing to extend. Vane stood. The movement was controlled, but its speed told her she had pushed to the edge of what he would tolerate in a contained way. I came here to offer you help. You came here to find out what we know, she said, and now you do. He looked at Elias. You'd let your wife speak to me this way? She's speaking for herself, Elias said. She's capable of that. Vane picked up the document from the table, folded it, replaced it in his coat. The motion of a man closing a door. When he looked at Margaret again, the performance of warmth was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was not anger exactly, but the cold, precise attention of someone recalculating consequences. You're making a mistake, he said. Whatever you think you found, it won't be enough. I've been conducting business in this territory for 20 years. I have relationships, legal resources, and patience that you cannot match. You also have a foreman standing in our barn who reports to you, Margaret said. We've known about Briggs for a week. We've been careful about what he hears. Vane's face did something complicated. The first real crack in the composure. He looked at Briggs through the window, at the man standing by the barn who could not hear this conversation. And Margaret watched Vane understand that the information channel he'd relied on had been feeding him a curated version of events. He left without another word. The riders followed. Margaret and Elias stood at the door and watched the carriage move down the drive, and when it turned onto the main road, Elias said, without looking at her, "That was a risk." It was a message. He needed to know that we know, before he does something irreversible, thinking we're still in the dark. Knowing we know might make him do something irreversible faster. Or it makes him cautious. Men who believe they're untouchable take risks. Men who know they're being watched hesitate. She looked at the road. We need 10 more days. Just 10 more days. They went inside and found Pike in the hallway, the satchel in his arms. He had heard enough. His face was the color of old paper. He knows I'm here, he said. Probably, Margaret said. Come, sit down. If he knows I'm here, and he knows what you said to him just now, then we move faster. Sit down, Mr. Pike. She said it with the particular firmness of a woman who has decided that panic is a luxury they cannot afford at this moment. He sat. She sat across from him. The meeting is in 12 days. We can't wait for the meeting. Elias leaned against the doorframe. What are you thinking? The meeting was designed to give us a large public venue, a moment where Vane couldn't suppress information because too many people would have it simultaneously. But we can create that same condition in a smaller way, right now, in the next few days. She looked at Pike. You said 11 completed transactions. 11 ranchers who lost land. Where are they? Some left the territory. 3 or 4 are still in the area, working other men's land mostly, or in town. Find them. Not all of them, but the ones who are still here and still angry. Bring them to Dorothy's store. Don't say why. Don't say my name. Just say there's information they need to hear about how they lost their property. She looked at Elias. And you need to talk to the other ranchers in the territory. Not about Vane specifically, about the aquifer, about what happens to everyone's water access if a single entity controls the eastern rights. Elias straightened. Every rancher in this territory has been watching the drought for 2 years. If they understand the water rights question, they'll care about it independently of anything else. This isn't just Elias Hargrove's problem, men. It's everyone's problem. She paused. Vane's power is built on isolation. We break it by making everyone's situation visible to everyone else. We don't need the meeting room at the Redstone Hotel. We need enough people talking to each other that the information can't be contained. The plan was not perfect. She knew that. Perfect plans required time, and she was running on days. But it was a plan built on the one resource she had more of than Vane expected: the trust that ordinary people extend to other ordinary people when someone is honest with them about what's happening. The next 3 days were the hardest kind of work. The kind that doesn't look like work, because it happens in conversations, in kitchens, at fence lines, in the back of general stores. Pike found 2 of the dispossessed ranchers, men who had lost their land and spent the subsequent years carrying the weight of believing it was their own failure. The first meeting in Dorothy's store lasted 2 hours. Margaret let the men talk before she showed them anything, because what they needed first was to understand that their stories were identical, that the progression of bad supplies and equipment failures and desperate loans was not their individual incompetence, but a single system applied to each of them in turn. When the second man, a weathered rancher named Alderman, whose land had transferred to Vane Financial Trust 3 years ago, looked at Pike's ledgers and found his own name in the transaction records, he sat for a very long time without speaking. Then he said, "I told my wife it was my fault. For 2 years I told her I failed us." "You didn't fail," Margaret said. "You were targeted." Alderman looked at the documents for another long moment. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man deciding something. "What do you need from me?" "Your testimony, your presence, your voice when the time comes." She paused. "And any ranchers you know personally who've had similar experiences with Meridian or Mesa Hardware or Summit Timber in the last 3 years?" He gave her 4 names. Elias's conversations moved in parallel, quieter and more circumspect, man to man at fence lines and water troughs and the edges of other people's property. He didn't lead with Vane. He led with water. He asked questions about how ranchers were managing aquifer access during the drought, what they understood about the eastern water rights, whether they'd heard anything about changes in territorial water law. The conversations opened themselves once the water question was on the table, because water in a drought territory was not an abstract concern. It was the difference between survival and ruin, and every rancher in Red Mesa knew it. On the 4th day, a rider came to the ranch with a letter. No envelope, no name on the outside. Margaret opened it. The handwriting was precise and controlled. The message was 4 sentences. "You have until Friday to accept my revised loan terms, including the easement provision. After Friday, the terms will not be available, and I will proceed with the existing default timeline. I would also encourage you to consider the legal exposure of any individual who has shared confidential business documents without authorization. Some things are not worth the cost of pursuing them." Margaret folded the letter and set it on the desk. Elias read it over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Friday is 3 days away," he said. "I know." "He's telling us he's going to move on the foreclosure." "He's telling us he's scared," she said. "A man who is comfortable in his position does not set a Friday deadline. He waits." She picked up the letter and folded it into her notes. "He's scared because he doesn't know exactly what we have or who we've talked to. He's trying to force us to make a decision before we're ready, because he knows that the longer this goes on, the worse his position gets." "Are we ready?" She looked at the desk covered in documents, at the careful stack of ledgers Pike had brought from Cimarron, at her own pages of notes, cross-referencing transactions and names and dates. She thought about Alderman's face when he found his name in the records. She thought about the 4 names Alderman had given her, and the 3 of those 4 who had already said yes when asked if they would stand up. She thought about 12 days becoming 3, and whether 3 was enough. "We need to move the meeting," she said. "The association meeting is set by the board. Vane controls the board." "Not the association meeting. Our meeting." She turned to face him. "Dorothy's store. The day after tomorrow. Every rancher we've talked to, everyone Pike has spoken to, everyone who has a reason to understand what Vane has been doing. We don't wait for the formal venue. We create our own." Elias was quiet, looking at her with that steady, measuring attention she had come to understand was not doubt, but precision. The look of a man checking a calculation before committing to it. "If Vane finds out before we're ready, he's already moving against us. The letter is evidence that we're out of time either way." She met his eyes. "We do this on our terms or we do it on his. Those are the choices." A long moment. The clock on the mantel marked it. Then Elias nodded once, the movement of a man who has weighed the odds and decided that forward is the only direction that makes sense. "I'll ride out tomorrow," he said. "Start making the calls." "I'll talk to Dorothy tonight." Margaret was already reaching for her coat. "And Elias—" She stopped. He waited. She had been going to say something practical, something about timing or logistics, but what came out instead was the thing underneath it, the thing she had been carrying since the night she read the loan document by a dying lamp and understood fully what they were up against. "Whatever happens in 2 days, whatever Vane does, whatever the outcome is, you should know that I came here thinking this was a transaction. A survivable arrangement between 2 people with nothing better on offer." She paused. "It isn't that anymore. I want you to know that." Elias looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not guarded, not calculating, not the careful blankness of a man protecting himself from a situation he hadn't chosen. It was the expression of someone who has been alone in something for a long time and has only recently understood that he isn't anymore. "I know," he said quietly. She went out into the evening to ride to Dorothy's, and behind her the lamp burned steady in the ranch house window. And somewhere across the territory, Cornelius Vane was writing a letter to his lawyers about foreclosure timelines, confident that Friday would settle the matter cleanly. He did not know about the meeting Dorothy Finch was already quietly arranging in the back room of her store. He did not know how many names were on the list, and he had not yet understood that the woman he had placed in this house to keep quiet had spent the last 10 days doing the one thing he had never once considered she might do. She had made friends. Dorothy's store held 23 people the night before Vane's Friday deadline, which was more than the back room was designed to hold, and more than Margaret had dared to hope for when she'd ridden out 2 evenings ago with nothing but a list of names and a calculation about how much time they had left. They came quietly, in 1s and 2s, arriving through the back alley rather than the front door, because Dorothy had suggested it, and because people in small towns understand instinctively the difference between a public gathering and a necessary one. Ranchers whose names Margaret recognized from Pike's ledgers. 2 women whose husbands had lost land to Vane Financial Trust and who had come alone when their husbands said it was too dangerous. Alderman, who had driven in from 12 miles out and arrived with his jaw set in the expression of a man who has decided that shame is no longer a useful emotion. And 6 others who had heard from a neighbor, who had heard from a cousin, who had heard from someone at a fence line that there was information they needed to see. Margaret stood at the front of the room with Pike's documents spread across Dorothy's cutting table and looked at 23 people who had each been carrying what they thought was a private failure and were about to discover it was a shared crime. She did not begin with the documents, She began with a question. "How many of you," she said, "lost a supplier to equipment failures or quality problems in the 2 years before you started doing business with Meridian Agricultural or Mesa Hardware?" Hands went up. Slowly at first, then with a gathering momentum of people surprised to find they are not alone. 14 hands out of 23. How many of you were referred to Meridian or Mesa Hardware by Cornelius Vane or someone working for him? 11 hands. Almost the same people. And how many of you have a loan currently held by Vane Financial Trust or transferred land to Vane Financial Trust in the last 5 years? 9 hands. And the 2 women whose husbands had sent them, both of their hands up, and the way they looked at each other across the room carried the full weight of 2 years of a story they had told themselves about bad luck and drought and their own failures. Margaret let the silence hold for a moment, because the silence was doing work that words could not. 23 people looking at each other's raised hands and doing the arithmetic of pattern recognition that each of them, in isolation, had never had the information to complete. Then she showed them the documents. Pike walked through the trust registration first, because that was the foundation. His voice was not steady, but it was clear, and he did not look at the door the way a man looks at a door when he is calculating the distance to it. He looked at the people in the room, which Margaret noted with a quiet relief, because it meant he had crossed whatever interior threshold he'd been standing at for 8 months, and was on the other side of it now. The trust registration named Vane. The subsidiary listings named his companies. The transaction records, organized in Pike's meticulous hand, showed the money flowing between them. And when Pike turned to the pages that showed individual rancher accounts, the deliberate quality degradation, the timed equipment failures, the loan terms constructed for default, the room made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a reaction, but was the collective exhale of people who have been holding something they didn't have language for, and have finally been given the language. Alderman said, "He told me my land wasn't worth what I thought. He told me I was lucky he'd take it off my hands at what he paid." His voice was flat and controlled, and underneath it was something hot that he was managing with significant effort. I believed him. I believed him for 3 years. He counted on that, Margaret said. Every person in this room he told a version of the same thing, that the problem was individual, that the failure was personal, that his help was the only reason things weren't worse. She paused. It was a lie constructed to keep each of you from understanding that what happened to you happened to everyone. A rancher named Collier, whose property had foreclosed 2 years ago, and who now worked a section of land he used to own as hired help for the man Vane had sold it to, said, "What do we do with this? Vane's got lawyers in Santa Fe, and a judge in this county who hunts on his land every fall." "The county judge is one judge," Margaret said. "The territorial court is something else. And the territorial court responds to documented fraud. What we have in these ledgers is not suspicion and not hearsay. It is a documented pattern of deliberate commercial fraud conducted over 6 years across dozens of transactions." She looked at the room. "No single one of you could make this case. Together, you are the case." "And in the meantime," Collier said, "Vane's been told he has until Friday to get a signature on a revised loan term. That's tomorrow. When he doesn't get it, he'll file the foreclosure motion with the county court," Margaret said. "Yes, and we will file a counter motion, citing fraud in the original contract, supported by the documentation in these ledgers and the signed testimony of everyone in this room who is willing to provide it." She paused. "The foreclosure may proceed while the fraud case is investigated. I won't pretend otherwise. But a foreclosure executed on a fraudulent contract can be reversed. Land can be returned. What cannot be undone is staying silent and letting him continue.
The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the women who had come without her husband, a woman named Clara Beaumont, whose family had lost their eastern pasture 18 months ago, said, "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign."
And that broke something open in the room, the way one voice sometimes can. Because it was a woman's voice, and it was steady. And the men in the room, who had been calculating personal risk, looked at Clara Beaumont and recalibrated what courage was required. By the end of the evening, 17 of the 23 had signed statements. Pike organized them at the table with the focused efficiency of a man who had found the thing he was supposed to be doing with what he knew. Dorothy made coffee and moved through the room with the quiet authority of a woman who has been the center of a community for 30 years and knows exactly how to hold people steady when they are making difficult decisions. Elias stood near the back of the room through most of it.
He did not speak much, which was consistent with everything Margaret had observed about how he operated. He was not a man who needed to fill space with his own voice to feel present in a situation. But she was aware of him the way she had become aware of him in the 10 days since the 14-minute wedding. A steady presence at the edge of her field of attention. And when she glanced at him near the end of the evening, he was watching her with an expression she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply decided to accept as what it was. They rode back to the ranch after midnight. The road was dark and the horses moved through it with the patient reliability of animals that know the way home. 17 statements, Elias said. It'll be enough. You sound certain. I am. She paused. The certainty isn't about the legal outcome. That will take time and lawyers and a territorial court that may or may not move quickly. The certainty is about the information itself. 17 people sign their names to what they know. That can't be unsaid. Vane can delay the legal consequences. He cannot put that back in the bottle. Elias was quiet for a moment. Cole Briggs is gone, he said. I found his bunk cleared out when I came back this afternoon to pick you up. He went to report to Vane. Which means Vane knows about the meeting. Vane knew before the meeting. That's why he sent the letter. She looked at the dock road ahead. Let him know. At this point, the more he knows, the more he understands that the situation he thought he controlled has become something else entirely. Friday came in clear and cold, the sky the hard transparent blue of early autumn. Margaret was at the desk before dawn, and she heard Elias come down the stairs and move through the kitchen without speaking, which was how they had learned to share the early mornings, separately and companionably, each giving the other the space of their own thoughts before the day imposed its requirements. Vane's lawyer arrived at 10 in the morning, not Vane himself, which told its own story about where Vane had decided to position himself in what he expected to follow. The lawyer's name was Hargett, a thin man with expensive clothes and the particular manner of someone accustomed to being the most legally informed person in any room he entered. He presented the foreclosure filing at the kitchen table with the careful formality of a man performing a function he has performed many times and expects no resistance to. Margaret read the document from the first line to the last, which took 12 minutes, and Hargett waited with the poorly concealed impatience of someone who considered reading a document you'd been handed a performance of skepticism rather than due diligence. This filing is predicated on a loan contract that contains fraudulent terms, Margaret said when she finished. I'd like you to take this back to your client. She placed a folder on the table. This is a summary of documented fraud in the original contract, supported by business registration records filed with the Santa Fe Territorial Office and signed statements from 17 individuals who have experienced the same pattern of deliberate commercial predation from your client's network of companies. She paused. I'd also like you to know that copies of these documents were sent this morning by post to the Territorial Attorney's Office and to a lawyer in Kansas City named Elias Welsh,
who specializes in land fraud cases and has been corresponding with us for the past week." Hargett looked at the folder. He looked at Margaret. For the first time since sitting down, he looked uncertain. The particular uncertainty of a man who came into a room expecting a transaction and has discovered he is in a different kind of situation entirely. "My client has legal standing to—" "Your client has a signed trust registration document naming him as sole beneficiary of the entity that owns the companies he used to defraud the people whose statements are in that folder," Margaret said. "Your client also has a former employee named Jerome Pike, who is prepared to testify in full detail about the operational structure of those companies and the deliberate practices used against individual ranchers."
She folded her hands on the table. "I am not a lawyer, Mr. Hargett. I am a woman who reads numbers and understands what they mean. What those numbers mean is that your client has been conducting systematic fraud in this territory for 6 years, and that the documentation of that fraud is now in the hands of enough people that containing it is no longer a viable strategy." Hargett picked up the folder. He did not open it at the table. He put it inside his coat and stood with the careful movements of a man in the process of deciding how to revise his understanding of a situation. "My client may wish to discuss alternative arrangements," he said finally. "My husband and I are available for those discussions," Margaret said. "In writing, through counsel." After Hargett left, the house was quiet for a moment. Then Elias said, from the doorway where he had been standing, "You told him we have a lawyer in Kansas City." "I sent Hiram Welsh a letter 8 days ago. He responded yesterday. He's reviewing the documents." She stood. "I didn't lie. I simplified the timeline slightly." Something crossed Elias's face that was unmistakably the beginning of a smile. Though it was the restrained kind. The kind that a man who does not often smile produces when something has genuinely surprised him into it. "You planned this 8 days ago." "I planned for the possibility 8 days ago." Planning for a possibility and knowing it will happen are different things. She moved to the window. "He's going to fight this. Vane will fight it through every legal mechanism available to him, and some that aren't. And it will be a long process. And there will be bad days in the middle of it. I want you to know that." "I know it." Elias crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "I've also known, since about the 3rd day you were here, that whatever came at us was going to be different than what came at me before." He paused. "Because before, I was facing it alone." She looked at him. He looked at the yard, where the morning sun was moving across the dry grass, with the particular quality of autumn light that makes everything it touches look like something worth keeping. "Margaret," he said, and then he stopped, because Elias Hargrove was a man who used words the way he used everything else, carefully, without waste, and what he wanted to say was larger than the words he'd built habits around. She watched him find the edge of it and decide to step over anyway. "I don't know what this is yet, what we are. I know what we started as, and I know what it isn't anymore. And I know that whatever it becomes, I'd like it to become it honestly, with you knowing that I see you clearly, and not the version of you Vane thought he was placing in my house." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a hawk crossed the pale sky above the south pasture with the unhurried precision of something that knows exactly where it is going. "My husband," she said. Her first husband, the doctor in Missouri, the man she had genuinely loved and genuinely mourned, used to say that the best partnerships are the ones where each person is stronger for the other's presence, not weaker, not diminished, but actually more capable of being themselves. She paused. "I didn't think I'd find that twice." Elias turned from the window. He looked at her fully, the guarded self-containment entirely absent, and what was underneath it was simply a man looking at a woman he had underestimated when she walked into his house, and had been revising his understanding of ever since. "I reckon,"
he said slowly, "that we've got a fair amount of work still ahead of us." "We do." "Legal proceedings, cattle to get to weight, a foreman to replace." He paused. "South Fence still needs better posts."
It does. Could use someone who knows what she's looking at when she's reading a supply contract. Could use someone who knows when to speak and when to let the situation speak for itself. She met his eyes. "Fortunate that you seem to understand that." He held out his hand. Not the gesture of a stranger, not the formal courtesy of a business arrangement, but the simple human gesture of a man offering a hand to someone he wants beside him. She took it. The legal case against Cornelius Vane took 14 months. It was not clean or quick or without its terrible days. The day the county judge ruled the foreclosure motion technically valid, pending fraud investigation, and they had 30 days to post a bond they didn't have. The day Hargett filed a countersuit claiming Pike had stolen confidential documents. The day Vane's men cut the water feed to the south pasture, and they spent 36 hours repairing it by hand in October cold. Margaret worked through all of it the same way she had worked through the first night with the ledgers by a dying lamp. Methodically, without self-pity, finding the next problem and the mechanism to address it. Hiram Welsh came from Kansas City in November and proved to be exactly what she had said he was. Honest, experienced, and possessed of the particular professional satisfaction that skilled lawyers take in cases where the documentation is complete and the fraud is provable. The bond was arranged through a consortium of 7 ranchers who had signed statements and who understood that the outcome of this case determined whether they ever recovered anything they'd lost. Pike testified twice and did not run. Alderman testified, and when he was done, sat in the hallway of the territorial courthouse for 20 minutes with his face in his hands. Not from grief, but from the complicated release of a man who has finally been believed. Vane's legal resources were considerable. They were not inexhaustible, and they were not, in the end, equal to 17 signed statements, 6 years of documented transactions, and a trust registration filed in Santa Fe by a man who had trusted his own impunity too completely to imagine he would ever need to account for it. The territorial court ruled in March. Fraud on 16 counts. The foreclosure reversed. Vane Financial Trust's holdings subject to review and restitution proceedings. Cornelius Vane, who had spent 20 years building his empire on the certainty that desperate people would not find each other, sat in a courtroom and heard his name attached to the words guilty and systematic and deliberate, and for the first time in 2 decades, looked like a man who understood that the ground beneath him was not solid. The land alderman had lost came back to him the following summer. Not all of it, but the core piece, the section his father had homesteaded, which was the piece that mattered. Clara Beaumont's family recovered the eastern pasture. 3 other properties were returned through restitution proceedings, and while the legal complexity of unwinding 5 years of fraudulent transfers meant that some things could not be fully restored, enough was recovered that the people who had believed their failure was personal understood at last that it had not been. Dorothy Finch expanded her store into the space next door, which had been occupied by a Meridian agricultural front office that quietly closed after the verdict. She stocked it with supplies from 4 independent regional sources, none of them connected to any entity that anyone named Aldridge had ever signed a document for. Elias Hargrove's cattle made sale weight in December, 3 weeks behind the original deadline, but sufficient for the payment that kept the ranch. By spring, the south pasture grass was recovering under a rotational grazing schedule Margaret had designed through the winter months, while the legal proceedings moved through their slow official machinery. The fence posts on the south drive were replaced with properly cured lumber, sourced directly from a mill in Colorado that Elias selected himself, without referral from anyone. Cole Briggs was not replaced immediately.
Elias spent a month doing the foreman's work himself and interviewing 6 candidates with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned the cost of trusting the wrong judgment. He hired a woman named Haskell, who had managed her late father's operation for 3 years and came with clear references and the particular professional confidence of someone accustomed to proving herself without asking permission. Margaret had recommended her. 2 years after the 14-minute wedding in the Red Mesa courthouse, the territory's agricultural board invited Margaret Hargrove to present her analysis of drought-resistant grazing practices at their annual conference in Santa Fe. She spent 2 weeks preparing the presentation with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to contracts and ledgers, and when she gave it in a room full of men who had not expected to be educated by a rancher's wife from Red Mesa, she gave it without apology and without the careful self-diminishment she had once used as protective coloration in rooms where she was not expected. The questions afterward lasted an hour. On the train back from Santa Fe, Elias sat beside her with his hat on his knee and watched the territory move past the window. And somewhere, in the long, easy quiet of the afternoon, he said, without preamble, "My mother would have liked you." She looked at him. He was still looking at the window. Why? She had a phrase she used about people who know their own worth without having to be told it. He paused. She said those people were rare, and you should keep them close when you found them. Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching his profile against the moving landscape. The man she had married to survive, and had stayed with by choice. The life she had built, not from the ruins of the one taken from her, but alongside someone who had turned out to be, in all the ways that counted, her equal. "She sounds like a woman who understood things," Margaret said. She did. He finally turned from the window and looked at her with the open, unguarded attention that he gave her now as naturally as he once gave her nothing at all. "So do you." The train moved south through the golden autumn country, and Margaret Calloway Hargrove looked at the land she had learned to read and the man she had learned to trust and understood with the clarity she brought to every true thing. That worth is not assigned by the circumstances that deliver you to a moment. It is built, deliberately, by what you do when the moment arrives, and by who you choose to build it with. She had been forced to sign a contract in a room where no one expected her to matter. She had used it to become exactly what she had always been, a woman who could not be made smaller than she was, no matter what the room required. That was not a thing anyone could take from her. It never had been.